Hello, good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Now, I'm not sure if you caught Eurovision last night. Liverpool did a great job in hosting, but the rest of the continent didn't really think much of the UK entry, which finished second last. Well, the government has once again got a big Europe problem here at home too. Rowing back on plans to get rid of all EU laws has riled up the Conservative right, and we'll hear from one of the most prominent on the show this morning. It feels like this weekend is when we're truly starting to see the fallout of those disastrous local election results. But are we going to see a change of direction from Rishi Sunak? Well, joining us this morning on the programme, we are going to be hearing in just a moment from the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary, Grant Shapps. For Labour, we'll talk to the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. And with Conservatives on the right voicing their concerns about the direction of travel, we'll speak to the former Business Secretary, that is Jacob Rees Mogg. We'll also talk live to the Mayor of Greater Manchester, who is Andy Burnham, and someone who is no stranger, shall we say, to the cut and thrust of politics, the former Downing Street Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, and his daughter, to keep him in check, the comedian Grace Campbell. That'll be worth a watch. Well, let's start this morning with the government. Just a few moments ago, I spoke to the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary, Grant Shapps. How would you describe the mood in the Conservative Party now?
So, look, of course, we have a great opportunity because we know that we're buzzing with ideas. We've got a lot of energy to get things done still, but of course, there are many challenges facing the country, and by the way, they'd be facing whomever was in power at this point in time. But the reason I say I think we've got opportunities now is that we're the party who, has managed to get unemployment very low, people in work, and despite the very, very tough times, we've looked after people through the latest crisis, which is the Ukraine war, by, for example, paying around half of people's energy bills this winter. So I think we've got the ideas, but also the practical solutions, not to say there aren't many challenges along the way.
And that's the pitch, but what's the mood like?
Well, look, I think that the mood is one of steely determination. I think we think that we know that there's a job to do, that we are on the side of the British people, and, whether that is getting inflation halved or growing the economy or reducing debt, dealing with the NHS waiting lists and the rest of it, stopping the boats. We're the ones who are on the side of the public.
Steely determination. You've got these two mysterious conferences that have sprung up, right? The Conservative Democratic Organisation in Bournemouth yesterday, the National Conservatism Conference in London tomorrow. As far as I can tell, the sole purpose seems to be to give Conservative MPs a platform to give Rishi Sunak a kicking.
I just think a great party like the Conservative Party, who sort of renews itself by buzzing with energy and ideas, always welcomes the idea that people are thinking through the problems that come ahead. When I was reselected as the MP for Welland Hatfield, my own constituency, my own local association, my own members wanted to know what my ideas were and tell them about their own. And so it's quite right for MPs to be able to meet, discuss ideas, and then play those into what will be a wider manifesto.
It feels like more than just discussing ideas, more than steely determination, doesn't it? Look, Priti Patel has said Rishi Sunak risks being responsible for the managed decline of the Conservative Party after the losses in the local elections. Nadine Dorries said you'd had an astonishing political tumble and you're going backwards. Are they right?
Well, look, I simply don't agree. If you look at any party after time in office, if you compared us with, for example, where Blair and Brown were through their period, we still have
far... But then went on to lose an election.
Well, hold on.
Is that what you're talking about?
No, the point is we still have far more councillors in place than they would have done during the same point of the electoral cycle. So this idea that there's something written in the stars, that somehow we cannot come back and win from our particular position at the moment, I completely and fundamentally disagree with. And, as I say, the fact that our MPs are still thinking of ideas, buzzing with energy, buzzing with new ideas, that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
I guess, listening to you, this feels like what some of these MPs are worried about. You've just had over 1,000 council seat losses, right? Labour are on course to win the next election. All of the polling says that. And yet what you're hearing from the top team is fingers in ears, la, 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 we're just going to keep on delivering.
No, that's not what I think at all. I mean, look, first of all, we've gone through an enormous global pandemic, and that's been expensive. And then we've gone through the war in Ukraine.
But this
and
again
that's
is what I mean.
But let me finish the point.
If I may, this is what I kind of mean, because I've been hearing these excuses from the Conservative Party for, the last year now in interviews.
But it's not,
it feels like there should be a change in tone and message after seeing Rishi Sunak's first test of the electoral box, and voters have given a very clear message.
And this is where this is, I think, fundamentally wrong. The test was not, as you suggest, Rishi Sunak's first test at the ballot box in that sense. It was probably people with their first opportunity to talk about what was a fairly difficult period last summer that people will remember. And this is the first time people have been asked to go to the ballot box. And I know, talking to my constituents, many of them have said, look, I just want to make the point that I was not happy with what happened last summer.
And what are you talking about specifically?
We had these changes of leadership, and it's been very well documented, as you know. But actually, people realise this country has gone through some pretty difficult times. And, of course, we won't have got everything right, but we have managed to steer the country through it, roll out vaccines, or provide up to half of the typical energy bill this winter, wrapped our arms around and tried to help people. And that isn't going to be easy to do. But Rishi Sunak actually has stabilised the party. I mean, I invite you to imagine, or people who think that, to imagine what it might have been like 4, 5, 6 months ago if the elections had been held there.
So managed decline rather than unmanaged decline, is what you're saying.
I just fundamentally disagree. And by the way, I think if you are sort of falling into or sharing the idea that it's completely inevitable that Sir Keir Starmer, who one day to the next simply doesn't even know what he believes in, but he'll always go where he thinks it's convenient to go. Look at the things he stood on to become leader of the opposition, which was a radical left platform. Look at the things he's saying now. He'll say whatever it takes.
What was the radical left part of his platform?
Well, of course, he tried to appeal to essentially...
But genuinely, what was the radical left part of his platform that he stood on?
Well, for example...
What's a policy example?
For example, he stood on 10 different pledges, many of which...
But which was radical left?
If you... Let me answer the question. Many of which carried on supporting some of the policies that, before him, Corbyn had in place. This is a man...
But what's the radical left
let me explain.
Agenda?
This is a man who sat in the Corbyn shadow cabinet whilst...
And has since kicked him out of the party.
And defended, essentially, therefore, Corbyn's anti-Semitism. He defended Corbyn's attacks on businesses, and he carried on playing, not on anti-Semitism, but in other areas, to that agenda in his 10-point plan that got him elected, then dumps it and says, no, I'm ready now to lead the country. And again, today in the newspapers, we learned that he has a plan to change the electoral system, to go further than was the case, for example, even when we were in the EU. So he seems to want to renegotiate Brexit again, so he wants to open up that again.
Just talking about that, actually, because that is one of the things in the newspapers today. Keir Starmer apparently looking at opening up the voting system so that settled migrants, for example, EU citizens who live, work, pay taxes in the UK, could get the vote along with 16 and 17-year-olds. Not something you support.
We don't have any plans to change the electoral system. And again, what he's actually doing, to put that in another, to make that clear, he's reopening the Brexit settlement. This is a settlement we have made with EU countries to have reciprocal arrangements so British citizens abroad are able to vote in, for example, the local elections, say, in Spain, and the same here. What he plans to do is actually reopen the Brexit settlement. So what else will he reopen? The Windsor framework, the cooperation agreement with Europe. This, again, is Keir Starmer doing whatever he thinks is practical to do at that moment in time, or in his personal advantage to do at that moment in time. He doesn't have fundamental ideas that he relies on. As I say, he stood on one platform. He's now shifting to a different platform, and he'll do the same with reopening Brexit. It's
clear that you want to talk a lot about Keir Starmer, but I'm keen to talk about your own policies, right? You're talking about promising one thing and then doing another. Well, let's have a look at Rishi Sunak's promise to scrap 4,000 EU laws. Why has he broken his promise?
Well, those laws are being scrapped, 2,000 of which, over 2,000 of which, will be gone by the end of this year. The reality is, as the libraries look for more of these laws that were sort of almost leftover pieces of law. More are being discovered in the archives, as it were, and so there's a practicality of simply getting those through. But just this week, the business secretary put down, I think, 600 more that will be scrapped. That will be over 2,000 scrapped by the end of this year, and we carry on that process.
Obviously, not the full pledge to get all of them off the statute book by the end of the year. I just want to read you something from yesterday's Times. Sources said that Shapps believed that the proposal to scrap or reform all EU laws in the UK statute book by the end of the year was entirely doable, and that good progress was being made when he was in charge of the policy.
Well, I should point out we're now several months on from when I was business secretary and looking after this process. So more of the laws will have been uncovered because that was the work that was going on. And so you've got to work with the practicality.
Is that source correct, though?
No. You've got to work with what's there, in the time that you're actually in that post. So
Brexit ideology meeting reality, then?
Well, look, I was never a sort of Brexiteer, so not my ideology, but all I was saying is things have moved on. Now, the current business secretary will quite rightly be looking at the body of laws there and working out how best to take them off our statute book. But here's the important principle. Why does it even matter? Well, we've left the EU. We shouldn't therefore have laws that sort of hang over and continue to dictate the way that our country operates. People voted to leave. I didn't, but lots of people did. And so we shouldn't have that on the statute book. But I've every confidence the current business secretary is looking at the plethora of these laws that are left. She's going to have more than 2,000 scrapped by the end of the year. She's just announced another 600. I think she's doing this the right way.
OK. There's been... let's talk about immigration, shall we? Because there's been an awful lot of focus on small boats and a policy on Rwanda which has affected exactly 0 people so far. But I just want to have a look at what's been happening to net migration. I think we can have a look now, because we have been seeing record levels of net migration to the UK. You can see they're absolutely jumping recently. And there are reports that this number is set to rise, to even double to 1 million. Are you in control of net migration?
You've just conflated 2 issues, actually. And I just want to sort of correct this. You've talked about small boats, and then you've talked about net migration.
Yeah, absolutely.
These are 2 different things. Small boats are
absolutely right.
Criminal gangs.
This is why I want to talk
not
about. This is what I'm saying. I'm saying that our immigration debate has been dominated by small boats, when actually I want to talk about this legal migration to the UK. That is skyrocketing.
Well, look. First of all, understand that 503,000 figures, or these larger numbers, include hundreds of thousands of people that you, me and many other people, myself personally, I've had 3 of these people have lived in my house in these numbers here in the last year. They're Ukrainian refugees. And this country has had a big heart. We've opened the country for Ukrainian refugees, for British nationals from Hong Kong. Take those 2 groups alone, and it's well over 300,000 of these numbers. And then, of course, we've had people from Syria and elsewhere. So actually, I'm rather proud of our record, but I do just caution against conflating 2 very different issues, that of illegal immigration, criminal gangs,
I'm just talking about
and legal migration.
Talking about legal migration, because there are reports that this number could double.
Well,
is that OK? I mean, maybe it is. Maybe you should say we should be relaxed about students, about...
We have a migration advisory committee that says, look, there's a shortage in this area or that area. One of the advantages now with Brexit is we have control over our own policies. So we can say we want people to help with this specific sector. But as I say, and you'll remember this a year ago, a huge clamour to ensure that we were providing safe haven to refugees from Ukraine. Yep. 3 of them lived in my house. So many other people were very generous and brought people into their homes, and that's included in these numbers.
No, just to be clear then, we should be relaxed, in your view, about high legal migration numbers, even if they hit 1 million, correct?
For a start, I don't think they're going to hit 1 million, and secondly, the important thing is that Britain has control. And if this country says...
So the question is, should we be relaxed by high levels of net migration?
Well, we should always make sure that we only have people come here that our rules and our policy bring here. So if we say we are going to invite people with grandfather rights from Hong Kong to come and live here, or Ukrainians...
It's still a bit unclear. Is that a yes, we should be relaxed with high levels of net migration?
The point is we should be proud of our record where it's people that we want here. But we should not allow people to come here where it is illegal, which is why it's outrageous that Keir Starmer
Let's not
votes
talk about...
against,
OK, listen.
Well, no, there's
you've
another
talked an
part
awful lot about Keir Starmer.
Okay,
I will talk to the opposition about...
OK, but when you do, please do mention to them. They keep voting against our bills to stop the small boats, and it's very important.
I thought we weren't conflating the two issues. I thought we were talking about legal migration.
But you were talking about illegal migration.
No, I didn't. I said let's not talk about legal migration. Let's talk about legal migration.
You started off on the boats. And I just want to make sure that we are clear.
I started off on boats to say let's not talk about the boats.
I just want to make clear that we are making sure that we are stopping that problem.
I would like to talk to you about strikes, if I may. Pat Cullen of the Royal College of Nursing demanding a double-digit pay rise for her members. Is that achievable?
I find this a very curious story indeed, because Pat Cullen just recently was encouraging her members to settle for the pay rise that was put on the table, that would see £5,000 go into the pockets this year of our hard-working nurses. I thought this was a great settlement. I thought it's terrific that it had been reached. It's frankly rather confusing now that, having encouraged her members to accept that deal, she seems to now be coming back and saying the opposite.
I guess maybe she's coming back because her members turned it down, so they can't have thought it was good enough.
Well, as I say, people will have to sort of judge this, but £5,000 into the pockets of nurses, more for people who are lower paid, a good contribution, because in that role there's 20% employer contribution to pensions as well. And I'm all in favour of this. I mean, I think our nurses work incredibly hard. I'm very pleased to see that settlement reached. But I think it's a bit odd for the union leaders who have said, accept this, and then come back and say, oh, actually, no, we now want to reopen something that she's already accepted once and encourage her members to accept. So
absolutely no to double-digit pay rise then?
Well, as I say, you've got to balance that with the rest of the public purse, and there's a very generous offer now on the table, five grand, this year would be coming to nurses, and I think that would be a great way to get this thing settled.
Do you take a bit of responsibility yourself about setting the tone when it comes to strikes? And I'm just asking because it feels to me like the train operators were one of the first people to go on strike when you were Transport Secretary. You didn't meet them. You said, don't risk striking yourselves out of a job, don't pitch yourselves against the public, something the RMT said they thought was a threat. And now, of course, we have this entrenched position with many of the sides in the debate. Should you have struck a more conciliatory tone? Well,
look, I just think with railways, we'd spent billions of pounds keeping the railways going during COVID. 40% of the passengers haven't come back again to the railways as yet. And they're therefore having to be propped up by huge taxpayer subsidy. And you've got a situation where train drivers, the ASLEF, union, for example, are on average paid nearly £60,000. The offer on the table puts it up to £65,000. I just think it's time to get this thing put to bed.
On another issue, if I may, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been investigating a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner, Steve Turner. Now, he instigated or triggered 2 police investigations into people that his political opponents. He was trying to be a councillor in Redcar. Should there be an investigation into what happened?
Well, look, other than having just heard about your reports, I'm not over the detail of this. I'm not familiar with the case itself, and obviously there are processes to be followed, and I think it's important that those are properly followed in the normal way and independently. I would suggest to politicians getting involved in it.
But it's important, I guess, to make sure that local people who have local power in areas like this should be held to account in the usual way.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, I want to sort of not comment on something that, there's a proper process in place for those kinds of investigations.
Now, I couldn't help but notice the Conservatives lost control of Welwyn and Hatfield Council in the local elections. You've got a relatively healthy majority, but are you a little bit worried about your seat?
I didn't win the seat the first time I fought it. I always treat it as a marginal, and I know that people have a choice how they vote. So I'm always on top of that. The council, as you say, has gone to no overall control with the Conservatives by a long way, the largest party. But I never take it for granted, never. And always work very hard for my constituents as a result in Welwyn and Hatfield.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Grant Shapps there speaking for the government this morning. We can get the view from Labour now, because yesterday the leader Keir Starmer said his reforms of the party would be like Tony Blair's famous clause 4 moment in 1995, but in his words, on steroids. Well, I can speak now to the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Firstly, I just want to look at reports in the newspapers this morning that Labour's looking at changing the voting system to allow settled migrants, so people who may be citizens of other countries but live, work, pay taxes in the UK, and also 16 and 17-year-olds to have the vote. What's the plan?
Well, good morning. Look, some of the speculation that's been in the press about Labour policy actually relates to our policy-making process. It's not our manifesto, it's not a statement of party policy, but it's how we go about doing that. We've got a process where people put in their submissions, they're deliberated on, they're voted upon. So this is not a statement of policy yet, but of course we're always looking at ways to strengthen our democracy, to involve as many people in possible as that, and there'll be an element of that, the reform of how this country operates, how power is shared in the Labour manifesto, that's for sure.
Do you personally think it would be a good idea to allow settled migrants and 16 and 17-year-olds to have the vote then?
Well, I think there are arguments for expanding the franchise. It's not an area I directly deal with in the Shadow Cabinet, so I'm not going to give a definitive answer on that. But I think we should always be seeking to involve as many people as possible in our democracy. That's what strengthens democratic politics. That's what we need to see encouraged, and I think we haven't seen enough of that in recent times. So it's something we will look at. But some of the reports, as I've got to stress, they're not the final plans for the Labour manifesto. This is about the process by which we achieve that manifesto.
I mean, it could be a pretty big expansion of the franchise if it was to be a Labour policy, one that could also potentially make it easier for Labour to win an election.
I don't think any changes to how the British state works, how democracy works, should be ever considered through any kind of party political lens. It should be about what is right for the country, what is the right way to make politics work better, and that would be the only criteria we would put forward. But it certainly wouldn't be any consideration of partisan advantage.
Of course, never. Thank you for giving us a bit of a steer, I guess, on the policy at least. Now, Keir Starmer says his Labour Party will have to be clause 4 on steroids. So that, of course, is the moment when Tony Blair rewrote the Labour constitution to ditch its commitment to nationalisation. I mean, that's pretty big talk. So what is it specifically that you want to do?
Well, Keir is laying out the scale of the challenge. And as we saw in the local elections when it got to polling day, the big questions for people in this country are they better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Do they think any public services work better after those 13 years? And the scale of the challenge, therefore, for Labour, it's not just turning around an economy that hasn't functioned very well for 13 years, it's the complete reform and delivery on public services in a way where the scale of that, I don't think, has ever been greater. And specifically for me, on the economic side of the Shadow Cabinet, that's bringing in the kind of modern industrial strategy we see in other countries. We see many parts of our economy, the automotive sector is a good example we're stressing today, where you need the state to be active, a partner, to draw in the kind of private investment that we're seeing in the US through things like the Inflation Reduction Act. But we haven't had a response here to that in the UK. And, you know, the fact that the UK has the lowest business investment in the G7, with all the good things, all the strength and innovation that we have in the UK, these are major problems, and Keir is laying out the scale of the challenge and his ambition and our ambition to meet that challenge.
It feels to me, I guess, that Labour are very good at laying out the scale of the challenge, but what we haven't heard so much of are like specific policy ideas. I mean, you can point to radical Blair policies, the minimum wage, for example. In his speech, Starmer even compares his government to the Labour government in 1945 when the National Health Service was first set up. And I haven't really heard much on that scale from this current Labour team, despite the rhetoric. Is it that you don't have the ideas, or you just don't want to tell us right now what they are?
No, I think our job is to articulate those and get them across. So what I'm talking about specifically here, I would say look at our pledge to reform business rates, a fundamental change of the business rate system, to change the apprenticeship levy, to let firms spend up to half of their apprenticeship levy funds on other forms of training. I would look at our promised changes to the planning system, to have an industrial strategy to begin with, to put in significant public investment through our Green Prosperity Fund, to leverage in the kind of private investment we need to see, and to make Brexit work. So if you specific policies on rejoining the the Horizon Science Programme, on agreeing a veterinary agreement with the EU, on having the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. I'd say these are all detailed things. Now, what we saw in those local elections was clearly the Conservative Party rejected and people choosing Labour over the Conservatives, but we know we've got more to do. None of us are complacent. We've got to get that message across of the scale of our ambition, of the hope we want to deliver back to the country, and why these specific policies that we've got deserve a hearing and that they are the answers to the problems. So, look, we know we've got more to do, but I don't accept the case that we're not putting forward specific policies, because I actually think, compared to many oppositions, a year, 18 months before a general election, we've got far more on the table than most political parties usually have at this stage.
I'm not saying that you're not putting forward specific policies. I'm just talking about the scale of it. When you're looking at the rhetoric from Keir Starmer, it's going to be clause 4 on steroids. We're going to talk about the 1945 Labour win. You know, they're talking about policies like the NHS, like the minimum wage. You know, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. That's $369 billion worth of policy. And one of the policies you mentioned is allowing firms to spend half the apprenticeship levy on other things. I'm just talking about the scale of what you're putting forward.
Well, I actually think the aggregate scale of what we're putting forward, a very different approach to the economy, a very different approach to public services, is worthy of that. And actually, many times you mentioned those previous governments, people at the times would have said this isn't ambitious enough, this isn't significant enough. It's only in retrospect you really get the sense of scale on that. But just to look at what we're putting forward in my area, in business and industrial strategy, this is a very significant change. It's real public money. It's not trying to match, by the way, the scale of the Inflation Reduction Act, because I don't think we can do that as a nation of our size and scale. But it is a very different approach to what we see at the minute, which is a government that has some quite eye-catching industrial targets, but no way to deliver that. We're promising the money that would go in to bring in that private investment, the changes to things like planning and the regulation of the national grid that would facilitate that, changes to the skills system, to business taxation. You add that up, and that is a compelling and comprehensive package. It's not the full picture yet. Of course, there'll be more for the manifesto, but I do think it's the kind of change that we need to turn around living standards and, of course, provide the revenue that gives us the chance to improve public services to the level the British people expect.
We had Grant Shapps on the programme earlier. He said that the mood in the Conservative Party is one of steely determination. How would you class it?
I'm not an objective observer of the Conservative Party, but I think it seems quite demoralised and, as ever, full of internal conflicts and battles. I look at Conservative MPs, and I think, to be honest, many of them are looking perhaps to a post-election period and the succession and who might take over. But look, we can't be distracted by that. We know we've got a mission to do to... we've turned the Labour Party around since 2019 in terms of its perception and the trust the public have in it. We know we've got to go further, win more people over, perhaps do more on the hope and optimism as well as the reassurance and credibility that we've had to re-establish. So whatever the mood in the Conservative Party is, it doesn't detract from the mission that we've got in the Labour Party.
OK, Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Reynolds there for the Labour Party. You're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. 2 pretty feisty interviews already this morning, and still to come on the programme this morning. We have an awful lot more guests. In just a moment, we'll talk to the former Business Secretary, Rees Mogg. It'll be interesting to see how his vision for where the Conservative Party should go differs from Grant Shapps. Plus, a bit later on the show, we'll also hear from the Greater Manchester Mayor, Andy Burnham. And then we're going to be joined live in the studio by Alistair and Grace Campbell. I wonder if they'll be quite as happy as they look in that photo there. Or if there can be a little bit of tension in father-daughter relationships. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. We'll also get some immediate reaction from our political correspondent Liz Bates, who is here with us this morning. Good to have you on the show, Liz.
Thanks, good to be here.
Anything that stood out for you already on the programme? Or?
I enjoyed the moment that Grant Shapps said that the Conservative Party had a general mood of steely determination, because from a kind of objective outsider's perspective, and I don't know how you feel about this, it feels to me a bit more like a kind of collective delusion and perhaps in certain circles a bit of maybe a bit of sadness.
You were at the event yesterday, right? One of the
I was
conferences.
At the event
what was the mood like there?
The mood there yesterday was, I mean, there were certainly a lot of Conservative members, some of them councillors. They were angry at the level of losses that had been inflicted on the party at the local elections, not happy with Rishi Sunak. In fact, a woman in the audience at one point stood up and shouted, "Rishi Sunak out." Now, these are not Conservative Party audiences that don't tend to heckle during conferences. So that was quite a moment. There was a real feeling, I think, of wanting to bring back Boris Johnson. There was an insistence from Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was there, that it was not about that, but everyone on the floor, I think, disagreed.
OK, we'll have to put that to Jacob Rees-Mogg in just a few moments, definitely. We'll have more from Liz later on from 9:30 as well, so definitely stay around for that. Thank you for being here, Liz. Thanks. Now, after the delay of the coronation, the fallout from the pretty disastrous local election results are really starting to be felt in the Conservative Party. We've heard, of course, from people like Priti Patel and Jean Doris, who've been withering in their criticism of the current leadership in the last few days. And the decision to pull back from plans to scrap all EU laws has also further angered some on the right. And in that wing of the party, they don't come more prominent than Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former business secretary who joins us now. Thank you so much for being on the programme. It was Rishi Sunak's first real test at the ballot box at the local elections. We heard from Grant Shapps, who said that the mood in the party is one of steely determination. Do you think that they really, those around Rishi Sunak, his allies, really grasped the scale of the challenge?
Well, it's obviously difficult when a party's been in office for 13 years, but Rishi Sunak has been getting on with business. Local election results are often bad for incumbent governments. They were bad for Tony Blair, and he then went on to win majorities. They were terrible for Margaret Thatcher, who then went on to win very big majorities. So I wouldn't read too much into local elections.
I think it's fair not to read too much into local elections. But are you seriously saying that Rishi Sunak could be like Margaret Thatcher on his way to win a big majority at the next election? Come on.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. I think politicians, we all love looking at elections and opinion polls and forecasting what's going to happen and all these sorts of things. But they are, in some ways, a distraction from policy. And what I think is interesting, and what yesterday was about, and what the NatCon conference tomorrow is about, is developing Conservative thinking and policy. What should we be doing that will make people's lives better? And that's where the retained EU law bill was so important, not as a totem of Euroscepticism, but how do we make the economy better for consumers by cutting prices through supply-side reforms, by getting rid of regulations that make things more expensive for people. And failing to do that has been a great mistake of the Business and Trade Department.
That's interesting, because, of course, this was your bill when you were Business Secretary, meant to see thousands of EU laws scrapped by the end of the year. At the same time, the Institute for Government has said that policy reality has finally prevailed over political rhetoric, and the bill was a poisoned brief from her gung-ho predecessors, most notably Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Sorry, you cut off briefly at the end of the quotation, but the Institute for Government is effectively the junior Ganymede equivalent for civil servants. The junior Ganymede was the club that Jeeves belonged to, as I'm sure your viewers all know. So I would only expect them to come out and give the line of the civil service, who've been very idle about this, need to have worked harder. But what we've got to understand is the point of getting rid of retained EU law. It's not about whimsical Euroscepticism. It's about making the economy better, whilst we're in an inflationary period. One of the ways to bring down prices is by tightening monetary policy. And the Bank of England's doing that, and that's difficult for people. The other thing you can do that brings prices down is free up the economy from over-regulation. And this is product regulations, this is the REACH regulations, this is making it easier for people to trade and do business, and that's such a missed opportunity, particularly in an inflationary environment. It's the so-called supply-side reforms that we have long needed.
So you're really saying, you mentioned Jeeves there, are you really saying that it's just civil servants who are effectively blocking this, and that Rishi Sunak and Kemi Badenoch are bound to that? Is that what you're really saying?
Well, Grant Shapps was confident, whilst he was business secretary, that it could be done. I was confident that it could be done, and it seems to me there's been a considerable lot of impetus in the last 3 months, partly possibly because of the reorganisation of the department.
I want to talk to you about taxes as well, because this is something that came up an awful lot yesterday. How concerned are you about the current rate of tax? Because people around Rishi Sunak are saying, look, at the minute, we've got to try and get inflation down. Actually, that's the best tax cut that anyone can have.
Well, oddly, I don't think I particularly disagree with Rishi Sunak on tax and spend, but I would be perhaps more hawkish on spending. I think the state is spending too much. We're up at 47% of GDP. We can't afford that level. That's why we've got the highest level of tax in 70 years. I'm not in favour of unfunded tax cuts, but I am in favour of reducing the size of the state, making sure the money the state spends is better spent, and allowing for tax cuts that way. And I think that's a matter of priority. The state is doing too much. So
where do you think these spending cuts should fall?
Where should they fall? Well, you've certainly got to look at the civil service. That when I was in the Cabinet Office, we had a plan to reduce the civil service by 91,000. I think we should cut things like HS2, which are a terrible white elephant. You begin to find there are many billions to be saved. Once you save the billions, you are able to give people their own money back. That's the thing to remember. There's no such thing as government money. It's all taxpayers' money. And the government should only take from taxpayers the minimum that is necessary to provide the services that are required.
And do you think Rishi Sunak gets that?
You must ask Mr Sunak, but I doubt he would disagree particularly with that view of Conservative values.
Now, you recently said of the Prime Minister, it's no good being holier than thou if you end up behaving like a Borgia? I'm no historian, right? I have no idea what a Borgia is. So what do they behave like?
Oh, well, actually, there's a very interesting revisionist biography of Pope Alexander VI, which indicates that he wasn't as bad as history is thought in, so perhaps the Borgias aren't as bad as all that. What I was saying was the Prime Minister gave a very clear promise on the retained
just to come in, if I may, what did they do? What were they known for?
Oh, the Borgias, nepotism and all sorts of carry-on going on. There's a very good set of
what kind of carry-on? What kind of carry-on?
All sorts of carry-on. I suggest you read the relevant books.
Just genuinely, if you've talked about Rishi Sunak, could you fill me in?
As I say, there's a revisionist biography on Pope Alexander VI. You might want to read that too. But the point I was making was that you can't put out a campaign video with the shredder working full speed about overheat, getting rid of EU laws, and then break that promise. That's the key, that promises that are given by politicians ought to be stuck to, particularly when they're that clear and specific.
You've referenced the Borgias, and you're being a bit bashful about telling me what they did. What did they do?
No, everyone knows about the Borgias. Everyone knows about the Borgias. But as I say, people have different views of
why won't you tell us what they did then, if everyone knows about them?
Well, I'm not here to give you a history lecture.
Come on.
I'm happy with the reference, but if people want history lectures, I'll give them on GB News between 8 and 9 o'clock every Monday to Thursday.
Oh. OK, well, you got your reference in there. Tell us what the Borgias did. What did they do? Educate me.
The Borgias, Pope Alexander VI was a Spaniard who became Pope at the end of the 15th century. He'd been in the Curia for many years. He was very unpopular with a lot of the Italians who didn't want to have a Spanish Pope. And his successor, but one, indicated that he had done all sorts of things he probably hadn't done, including having children, which for a Pope is unusual. He was certainly nepotistic. He certainly appointed his nephews to important posts within the Curia, and he may have been poisoned at the end of his life. It's not entirely clear. There's a sort of brief canter through the history of the Borgias, which I must confess I wasn't expecting to be talking about this morning.
So corrupt, effectively. Is that what you're really referencing to Rishi Sunak?
No, I think you're delving into this far too much. Now, I don't think he is corrupt, but I think he broke a promise. That was the point.
Was it a mistake to get rid of Boris Johnson, in your view?
Oh, yes, of course it was. I've said that a million times. But it would be an even bigger mistake now to get rid of Rishi Sunak. The Conservative Party cannot keep on changing leaders. We must back the leader we have got.
So
I'm supporting Rishi Sunak. Let me be clear about that. And I said this at the conference yesterday, the CDO conference, that the Tory party would be toast if we changed leader again. And therefore we need to support the leader we've got. But that doesn't mean we agree with him on every policy. And to have a debate about policy is important and I hope interesting for Conservative members in the country at large.
And now, just finally, you, of course, used to be the Brexit Opportunities Minister. Now, we've got someone on later, you've probably heard of him, Alistair Campbell. You know, he's no fan of Brexit. And I'm sure he's going to be very vocal in giving us all of the reasons why Brexit has been a big disaster. So help me out. What would you come back to him on to say these have been the benefits of leaving the European Union?
OK, well, we saved £191 billion, £191 billion, by not being in the EU for its COVID recovery fund. That would have been our share of the EU's recovery fund, 191 billion. That's one thing. What else? We've got a free trade deal with Australia, which will be much better than the forecasts predict. We were able to show global leadership over Ukraine. Putin would probably have invaded Ukraine successfully if the UK had been bound in by the requirement of sincere cooperation and had to follow a Franco-German line in dealing with Russia, which is what we did in 2014. So those are three huge benefits.
So
And
you
the first
genuinely
one,
believe
a
then...
cash benefit to British taxpayers.
So you genuinely believe that Putin would have successfully invaded Ukraine if the UK had been part of the EU?
I think the leadership shown by Boris Johnson, which he could only do because he was not bound by sincere cooperation, ensured that a coalition was set up that made it impossible for Putin to succeed. And I think if that hadn't been the case, we'd been bound by this concept of sincere cooperation, we'd have had the mucky compromise that was delivered in 2014 when Russia invaded the Crimea. I think it's really important. But above all of this, we've got democracy, so we can decide how we're governed rather than having to do what we're told by Alistair Campbell's mates.
I'll put that to him. Thank you very much indeed. Jacob Rees Mogg on the programme today.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Now, regional mayors have become an established and increasingly prominent part of our politics. Think Andy Street in the West Midlands, Sadiq Khan in London, and in Greater Manchester we have Andy Burnham. Now, he's now been in the job 6 years. He recently signed a new devolution deal with Westminster that expands his powers, and he joins us now. Thanks very much for being on the programme, Mr Burnham. So we just mentioned there the devolution deal. It's seen as a bit of a trailblazer. What are you going to do with the new powers?
Yes, it's quite exciting, actually, Sophie. We've got the ability now to have more control over post-16 technical education, and we've long called for that, because I believe it's an issue that the country has neglected. When youth education in England, it's been dominated by the university route under all parties, to be honest. So we have the chance now to fix it. So instead of just there being one clear route for young people towards university, which starts with English baccalaureate, then goes to A-levels, and then UCAS, and ends obviously with a degree. We want to create an equivalent route for young people who want a technical qualification or a good job in the Greater Manchester economy. So we're going to bring in the Manchester Baccalaureate. That will lead towards T-levels and other technical qualifications. We then have GMAX, which is our equivalent of UCAS, to try and help people find opportunities in the Greater Manchester economy, and then it takes people to a good apprenticeship, a degree apprenticeship, or another higher qualification. So it's really exciting, to be honest. It's just the reform that Greater Manchester needs right now. We're a really fast-growing, successful, vibrant, modern economy. You can see that in the skyline of our city centre, but there's a risk we won't bring through the talented young people that we need, and this fixes it.
You're obviously pretty excited by some of those opportunities. Do you think we should give the government some credit for being serious about devolving powers outside of Westminster?
Yes, and I do. You know, I very much take a place-first rather than party-first approach in my role as Mayor of Greater Manchester. And I try to call it as it is. I'm conscious that when I was elected in 2017 and then again in 2021, people of all political persuasions lent me their support. So it's important that I am a voice that represents all of that opinion and puts our place first. And the government does deserve credit for delivering a devolution agreement that takes Greater Manchester to the next level. So it's not just more power over technical education. We're going to be able to do something about housing standards, particularly in the private rented sector, by bringing in a Greater Manchester Good Landlord Charter. Also, people know we've been on with a major reform of public transport. Next month, I will put out a London-style integrated fare structure that will make public transport cheaper in Greater Manchester. And in time, we can bring the trains into that integrated system. It was a bit of a victory for the mayors, I have to say, last week when the Transport Secretary agreed to our request to bring TransPennine Express under public control. That gives us a real opportunity now to reshape the railways in the north and make them work much better for the public.
There's going to be more scrutiny too of your role, right, including from committees of local MPs. And Sky News recently did a story about a police and crime commissioner who triggered 2 police investigations into his political opponents. Do you think that there is a risk that as we give more power to local bodies, whether that's police and crime commissioners, whether that's mayors, and partly, of course, because of frankly, the decimation of local press, that there is a risk about scrutiny and holding people to account properly?
Yes, I do, and I worry about it because devolution in England is working. It really is working. Just look at the positive energy that's flowing around Greater Manchester right now. We are beginning to see the rebalancing of the UK economy, and it's a great thing. And obviously, when you have power at this level that we have, you can make change from the bottom up with people. And I think Keir Starmer was touching on these themes yesterday. It's really working, and I would hate to see it derailed by some corrupt practices of the kind that you're mentioning. So when I was in the discussions with the government, and they were saying that they wanted stronger accountability structures and arrangements, and actually Conservative MPs in Greater Manchester were saying the same thing, that they were unhappy with power being given without the checks and balances. And I agreed with them to us. And I said to the government, look, you go as far as you like. That's the deal. If we get more power, I don't mind at all, being hauled before any parliamentary committee. And in fact, what I've suggested is that the government sets up a Greater Manchester Grand Committee in Parliament, similar to the Scottish Grand Committee and the Welsh Grand Committee, so that it can be full scrutiny of what we're doing. So you were right to raise that issue, but we don't fear it at all.
Now, I just want to talk to you a bit about national politics, if I may, because obviously Labour did rather well at the local elections. It seems pretty clear that right now, if the polls and if the local elections were projected onto the House of Commons, it would be Keir Starmer in number 10, but not necessarily with a majority. What is your take on this whole row about whether Keir Starmer should rule in or out a coalition with the Lib Dems? What do you think?
Well, I don't think he needs to at this point in time. He needs to set out his own stall. And he's doing that, and he did that yesterday. I read the speech. I don't think the headlines did justice to it. It was quite a considered speech. And I think increasingly now he's got that opportunity to lay out a programme that will deliver a good working majority for him and a Labour government. The local elections told us very clearly that the public is ready for change. And I think it also said it's not yet, in the position where it's completely clear that it's a majority Labour government. But I think we will get there. And that's the next phase of the project that I think Keir and the Shadow Cabinet are building. And I hope they can draw on some of the things that we're doing. I think it would be a mistake to suggest this will be like 1997 all over again. We need to come up with a programme that's right for the times that we're in. I was really proud, obviously, to be in that government and all the great things that we did. But looking back, I would say we did neglect some issues. So we did focus too much on the university route, as I was saying before, and we should have done much more on technical education. When it comes to the NHS, it shouldn't always just be about targets and recruiting more doctors and nurses. We should have fixed social care when we were in power, and I'd like to see a radical agenda kind of developed around that as well. Or if you take housing, promoting home ownership is an important thing, but if you do that on its own, you'll still have a housing crisis. And actually, you need a housing policy that's about building more modern council homes, social homes, and also, as I said before, getting serious about housing standards in the private rented sector and much stronger regulation there. So develop an agenda that's right for now, and Labour will get that majority government. And so it's exciting times for the party.
If they fall short of the majority, then one of the things the Lib Dems could be demanding is proportional representation, a change to the voting system. Do you think that should be a red line for Labour, or do you think it's something that perhaps Labour should also embrace?
No, I do. I've come round to it. I'll be honest, I wasn't always in this position. But when you step outside of Westminster, you look at things afresh. And, I've looked at how power doesn't really flow properly throughout this country. The first past the post system, I think, hands more power to the establishment than it does to MPs actually, but beyond that to people. And I think PR would put the people much more in control. Every vote would matter. And so I've come round. I've got the zeal of the convert. I personally believe if you're going to really make this country work properly for all people and all places, it's a combination of proportional representation for the Commons, a Senate of the nations and regions to replace the unelected Lords. Because how can it be right in this day and age that all places aren't represented equally in our national parliament? And then thirdly, I would have maximum devolution of power to the regional or city region level, like we've got in Greater Manchester. That would make the country work much better, make it much fairer for everybody. And I would like to see that agenda not be taken off the table, let's say.
OK, thanks very much. Pretty clear. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much.
Now, there are a few political names that stir as many strong feelings, shall we say, as Alistair Campbell, someone who's not shy in expressing his own. Well, the former New Labour spinner has become a hit podcaster. He also has a new book out. And his daughter, Grace, has built her own very successful career as a writer and comedian. She's also known for her defence of feminism. And they both join us now. Thank you very much for being with us. I have to say, I'm quite excited about having you both on the programme together. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
No, good to see you. So you've got a new book out. You say that politics is broken. Why?
I think the big breaker of it has been some of the issues you've just been discussing with Andy there. I think populism, polarisation, and the fact that we're now, thanks to Brexit and Boris Johnson, in a post-truth world similar to Trump's America. And added to which, I think that a lot of people of Grace's generation are just sort of looking at politics and thinking, I think they really, really care about the world, really care about trying to make change in the world, but they're looking at politics and how they see it done and thinking this just has very little to do with me.
Yeah, do you think that's right then?
I mean, I do, yeah, increasingly so. Especially at the moment, the Tories feel so far removed from, like, most people I know and lots of people of my generation. And then also, I think, like, culturally, they just feel really far removed from us. But I think, I mean, we've been talking about this for such a long time, actually, because since I started doing activism, I guess, I've realised how many young people, and this was when I was actually young. I feel like I can't.
How old are you now?
I just turned 29.
That's definitely still young.
I know.
In my book, that's anything under 30
Yeah, but then
young.
Young people are like so much more impressive. You know, like late teens, people in their early 20s at the moment are just doing such unbelievable things. But I remember thinking that when I started doing all of that, I was like, well, there are all of these young people who are unbelievably impressive and inspiring, but wouldn't consider a career in politics. And that's really depressing.
It is quite depressing, isn't it? Don't you think? Do you think that actually politics is turning off, and I not even making this party political, but just generally just turning off young people from politics, from running to be MPs?
Well, I think there's lots of... I actually think that the way that the media covers politics as well is a problem. I think people look at it, and then social media as well, you know, women, young women and women of colour in particular, the abuse that they see other women getting, it puts them off. But Grace is right. I mean, you know, I was really pleased to hear... I saw your interview with Jonathan Reynolds. I really hope Labour are going to fight to lower the voting age. I think that's really important. I see... The reason I've written the book, the title, But What Can I Do? The title comes from the fact that that's what young people say to me the whole time. But what can we do? Because this isn't the politics that we sort of feel we need. And again, I thought Andy was interesting there, that, you know, the change that the politics has, it's got to be much more than a change of government. We've got to change the way that we do politics. And we've got to understand young people have got so much energy, they have got so much commitment. Not all of them. I remember, I say in the book that when Grace was like in her teens, and I said, look, we should lower the voting age. And I remember Grace saying, Dad, you've met some of my friends, they know nothing about politics. And I would say, yeah, but 40s, 50s, 60s, 70-year-olds, we just need massive political education in this country. You know, what was the most Googled thing the day after the referendum? What is the EU? I mean, that's terrifying. So I think that Grace's generation is the answer to a lot of these problems, and you know, we've got to have such big change, and it's.
But I think in order to get a lot of those people to want to go into politics, politics has to change, and the way that we treat politicians has to change. And I think that you know, I think about this a lot. I mean, less and less so, but I used to get told a lot that I should go into politics. I think now my comedy is quite like the opposite of what politicians are allowed to
So
talk
there'll be
about.
a few things that would
I think
be
there are
crop
things
up
that are
on
quite
Twitter videos
problematic
against
now.
you.
Yeah, but I used to get that a lot, and I never ever was attracted to it because of the abuse that you get, and I saw that firsthand like my entire childhood, and then also the way that a lot of the time you aren't actually allowed to say what you think and how you feel, and you have to sort of, you know, you're really scared of what other people and like what your party might say to you. And then the abuse that women get online, women of colour, I mean, it's just horrific. Like, why would you want to do that?
Well, because you can change the world.
Yeah, but you can change the world in other ways.
You can,
I
yeah,
think that's the
true.
thing that people see now, is that actually sometimes you can have more power shouting from the outside, which maybe, you know, well, look at you. Look at you having a resurgence in your career now.
Now you're shouting from the outside.
Yeah, shouting from the outside.
Well,
Well, he's always been
outside or
shouting
outside, yeah.
wherever he is. But...
No, but the thing is, like, I talked, for example, about Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg is a great example of somebody an individual who just started a protest and has made a difference. And it's true she's made a difference, but ultimately, if you're really, really, really going to make change, you've got to get in and lead governments. That is where the big change
Do you
is going to come
think
from.
Keir Starmer is ready to make big changes? Because in the interview with Jonathan Reynolds, I guess what I was trying to say is, look, there's a lot of rhetoric right now coming out of the Labour Party saying we're going to be on clause 4 on steroids. They're referencing 1945. Where's the evidence of a radical policy?
I thought it was a really... I watched your interview in the green room, and I thought it was a really interesting interview because I could see where you were coming from and I could also see where he was coming from. What I really like about what Keir's done is he's so methodical. People say he's dull and he's boring. He's just methodical. And I think we need a bit of that. So he's gone stage 1, decontaminate Labour brand post the Corbyn period. Stage 2, show that the Tories are absolutely useless and unfit to govern. Stage 3, here's the big positive agenda. And I think what's going to happen with these missions that they've got, and now this rhetoric, as you say, is they're now setting themselves that target for those big policy ideas to come. They've now got to happen. And I kind of agree with both you and Jonathan. I think there is a lot there that they're projecting, but actually for the public, there's very little sense of how that's going to affect and change their lives. And I think that's the next stage for Labour. So I was more hopeful after yesterday, actually, that Labour really does understand the scale of the challenge. And they can never, again, Jonathan made this point, no matter how bad the government is, you can never rely on that. You've got to focus on your own agenda, your own strategy, and get it over the line.
What do you make of Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean... Actually, I think he's doing a good job now. I mean, I am so sick of the Tory government that we just need to get Labour in power. And I have, you know, there are things that Keir does that I guess like annoy some people of my generation. But I just keep saying, like, I know so well from growing up with him, and this has been his rhetoric my entire life, there is nothing you can do when you're not in power.
What was it like growing up with Alistair Campbell as your dad?
Loved it. She's got good comedy material.
Yeah, I mean, look,
That's true, actually.
it was like a rich territory for comedy. It was very interesting, never a dull moment with him, I would say. But it was also at times quite stressful. I'm very protective of him. You know, like, I don't like people saying bad things about him. I feel sometimes I have to be with him in case he gets into an argument.
So you're a bit like his bodyguard.
It would have been really bad, but thankfully I was there.
Anything in
and
particular
he doesn't
you wanna share
like
with
fighting
us?
in front of me because he's such a nice guy.
You just do it away from Grace then instead, right?
Do it in Newsnight
He used to
Studios.
take me places when I was a kid, because then he felt it would calm him down if I was there. He'd be less likely to get into a blow-up.
What's the biggest thing you two disagree about?
Actually, do you know what? I really feel he's listened so much on, like, you know, women's stuff. And I think, you know, I do credit myself to a lot of him now being really aware of things that he just wasn't
Anything
before.
in particular that you give an example
Well, I
of?
just like the treatment of women and, like, the things that women go through that I guess, like, a lot of men need to listen to more and need to not just, like, pretend they're listening, actually engage in and understand, like, what it is like to be a woman in this society.
I give a
culture.
specific example I actually write about in the book is the period poverty campaign. I'd never really thought about that. And it was only when Grace came along with her friend Scarlett Curtis and sort of sat me down and said, look, this is really, really, really bad, and why is nobody talking about this? And then the next thing, they were running a campaign and they got a change in the law.
But also, even on a sort of, like, taboo thing, he didn't even, like, really like talking about periods then. And then I've confronted a lot of that, of, like, normalising some of the conversations that should just not be a shameful thing for women to have to talk about.
It does genuinely feel like that we are the last 5-10 years, stuff like periods we can talk about on TV, which I just can't really imagine that happening so much when I was growing up or young women.
Well, I can remember the argument going on in I can't remember which budget it was, but there was a budget about whether there was a discussion about whether we can say tampon tax. I mean, it was like
It's
ridiculous.
crazy.
It's ridiculous.
You actually can't. Now, I have to admit, right, I did an event recently with your dad, and I was quite surprised by the amount of attention that he got. He was mobbed. There was one woman who came up to you with a sex god badge. I mean, how on earth...
And then he wore it for a week.
How do you keep his ego in check?
Yeah, how do you do that? Quite easily.
Yeah, I mean...
I guess you get quite a lot of attention the other way as well, right?
I think me and my mum humble him quite a lot, actually.
Humiliate is the word.
But I think it's a good thing because he can get a bit, you know, big for his boots sometimes. So I think you need to...
You were shocked, though, weren't you?
I was, but then I have got... I'll be honest, on social media, there's plenty of people the other way as well,
Oh, yeah,
so I wouldn't
sure.
worry too much.
Yeah, but they're the ones who go on social media, but the ones who come to your face tend to be very, very nice. That's why it's quite nice being out about.
Yeah, just don't go on Twitter, just go to
I
him.
don't really bother about Twitter.
Now-
I tweet too much, but I don't look at the comments.
But we did a video when I was on tour in Leicester and we went up to people in the street saying, have you ever heard of Grace Campbell? Nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew who you were.
There you go.
So 2 people...
Who were coming to my show.
Who went to bingo, bongo.
No, they didn't know who you were.
Bongo bingo. Bongo bingo.
Now, we spoke to Jacob Rees Mogg earlier on the programme, and I asked him about the benefits of Brexit to put to you, right? He talked about the not having to be part of the £199 billion COVID recovery fund. He talked about the free trade deal with Australia. He talked about the global leadership with Australia and Ukraine. And he said, above all, it's about democracy so that we don't have to be told what to do by Alistair Campbell and his mates.
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Well, I'd say on Ukraine, I would definitely say that the UK has done a good job in relation to Ukraine, but that has nothing to do with us being outside the European Union. The Australian trade deal and all the other trade deals they're either cut and paste from what we had with the EU, or they're adding a minuscule amount in the long term to our trade, which has meanwhile been absolutely battered. Jacob Rees Mogg's dad is a big part of the book because Jacob Rees Mogg's dad, William, wrote a book back in 1997 called The Sovereign Individual. And that is what Brexit is about for the Jacob Rees Mogg types. And it's sort in your interview, it's about getting rid of taxation, getting rid of regulation, and actually getting rid of democratic control. So I actually think if that's the best he can do for the benefits, given he had the job, Secretary of State for Brexit Opportunities, it underlines to me the fact that Brexit is going very, very badly wrong.
What about not being told what to do by Alistair Campbell and his mates?
Well, I don't think I'd tell anybody what to do. He's an elected politician. The government has the power. And the argument I got into on Newsnight the other night was about this whole question of sovereignty. The whole thing about sovereignty was a myth because the sovereignty always lay in the UK Parliament to pool some of that sovereignty with other nations. And since we've stopped that, I mean, that's cheered me up, that, because Jacob Rees Mogg, who spends his whole life thinking about this, to me has got not a single benefit of Brexit that he's put forward.
Well, I'm sure that viewers will draw whatever conclusions they like from Jacob Rees Mogg and Alistair Campbell. Thank you both.
But what can I do?
Thank you very much indeed for being on the programme today. Really good to have you on as well. Thank you, Alistair and Grace Campbell there. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment after the break, we will run through today's interviews, looking at what we learned with our political correspondent, Liz Bates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday. back. This is Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take, a chance to look back at some of our interviews on the programme this morning, try and work out what we learned. It really feels to me like this weekend is where we really start to feel the impact of those local election results. It was a bit delayed because of the coronation, but now the impact in the Conservative Party and the different factions of the Conservative Party are really coming to the fore. We had Grant Shapps on the programme this morning for the government, and he was trying to say that actually, look, the party is full of steely determination. There's no issue to see here, but we've got these two conferences, one yesterday, one tomorrow, and it really does feel like the kind of warring wings of the Conservative Party are starting to be felt. Managed decline is how Priti Patel put it, and as a result we're seeing lots of ideas for things that Rishi Sunak needs to do differently. Let's have a quick listen first. We'll get our thoughts from our political correspondent Liz Bates in a moment, but first let's just have a little listen to Grant Shapps. I asked him simply describe the mood of the Conservative Party.
I think that the mood is one of steely determination. I think we think that we know that there's a job to do, that we are on the side of the British people, and, you know, whether that is getting inflation halved or growing the economy or reducing debt, dealing with the NHS waiting lists and the rest of it, stopping the boats, we're the ones who are on the side of the public.
Grant Shapps there. Well, let's talk to Liz Bates now, shall we? Now, Liz, you were at one of these conferences yesterday, right? So you heard from all of these figures yesterday. Would you sum up the mood as steely determination?
It certainly wasn't at the conference that I was at. The conference that I was at was largely disillusioned Conservative Party members and some of those MPs as well that were very big during the Boris Johnson years. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nadine Dorries, Priti Patel, they are very much in the wilderness at the moment. So, of course, they're not particularly happy with the direction of travel. And, look, it's not at the level of full-on revolt. Jacob Rees-Mogg was at that conference. He was urging people to get behind Rishi Sunak. But what I think it shows is the honeymoon period for the Prime Minister is over. The factions in the Conservative Party still exist, and there is trouble brewing. And I think the message from that conference was, we're keeping an eye on you. We still have a level of power to keep you in line if we think you're going off in the wrong direction, and we have the party membership behind us.
I guess my kind of big thought after the local elections, right, is where does Rishi Sunak go? You heard Grant Shapps there saying, look, it wasn't a referendum on Rishi Sunak. It was basically people expressing their frustration with the last year of Conservative Party chaos, as in Liz Truss and everything else, rather than just Rishi Sunak. But the message from that seems to be that they're not going to change direction. They're going to focus on delivery. They're going to focus on the aims that he's already set out. Do you think that's going to be enough to appease those on the right of the Conservative Party?
I mean, I think the way that you've set it out there perfectly represents the challenge that Rishi Sunak faces, because he is at the end of almost 13... Well, we don't know if it's at the end of this, but it's starting to feel like the end of 13 years of Conservative government. He has to face the nation, sell himself, show that there is a future for the Conservative Party that is new and different under him. At the same time, he has to appease his party, but also take on the Labour Party, which is showing a credible alternative. These are the different challenges that he faces. And I think what you can see from what Grant Shapps was saying this morning is the way that they're going to manage that is they are going to take a strategy, plough ahead with it. It's about delivery, it's about competence. The problem for Rishi Sunak is I think he was doing well, certainly in Westminster, and there was a feeling among his party that he was showing that the Conservative Party was now the party of competence, and that would go down well with the election. Well, we see from the local elections that it hasn't, and they haven't changed course, and that's why these different factions are starting to get a bit irritated.
It felt to me like it was a bit of a beauty pageant for the next leader. Is that fair? Are we starting to see that? I mean, I know we haven't even got an election called yet, so that feels a long way off. But it felt a little bit like that, right?
I think we are getting into that territory. I mean, the interesting thing about the Conservative Party is I think certainly over the past few years, it's changed in terms of its approach to leadership. It used to be a party that would, in difficult times, unite because they just simply do not want to lose power. They want to keep winning general elections. Well, this is a party that has become increasingly mutinous, and that's what was certainly on my mind yesterday at that conference, was that they are much more willing now to remove their leaders. We've seen it happen. And we know as well that Boris Johnson, I mean, I spoke to Nadine Dorries yesterday, she was insisting that Boris Johnson is really enjoying his time off and doesn't want to come back. We know that Boris Johnson will always wait in the wings to cause trouble. But I think there's many other characters now that are thinking about the next leader. That's a real problem for Rishi Sunak. It feels like end of days territory.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for the analysis, Liz. The other thing that I was keen to talk to Grant Shapps about on the programme was strikes, because it does feel, look, if he's pitching himself as the deal maker, if he's pitching himself as the person who can sort out some of the issues facing the country, then public sector strikes has got to be right up there on his priority list. And of course, the leader of the nursing union, the RCN, Pat Cullen, has said that the next round of pay rise negotiations would have to start in double digits. This is what Grant Shapps had to say.
It's a very curious story indeed, because Pat Cullen just recently was encouraging her members to settle for the pay rise that was put on the table, that would see £5,000 go into the pockets this year of our hard-working nurses. I thought this was a great settlement. I thought it was terrific that it had been reached. It's frankly rather confusing now that, having encouraged her members to accept that deal, she seems to now be coming back and saying the opposite.
So absolutely no to double-digit pay rise then?
Well, as I say, you've got to balance that with the rest of the public purse, and there's a very generous offer now on the table, five grand, this year would be coming to nurses, and I think that would be a great way to get this thing settled.
I mean, I guess away from the noise, this is one of the most important stories this weekend, right? Pat Cullen saying, look, we want a double-digit pay rise for nurses.
Yes, and this is something that seems like it's going to go on and on, both sides digging in. It also shows the problems that Rishi Sunak is facing. This is the reality. These are the things that voters really care about. The strikes across the board, but also the NHS not functioning properly. And then when you actually look at the party, they're arguing about things like taking retained EU law off the British statute. So this is the Conservative Party needing to face reality, needing to sort out these problems and not being able to, and then also having lots of internal arguments as well. And I think that's why it feels like the party is in a really difficult place at the moment.
Let's talk a bit about Labour, shall we? Because obviously you could see Labour being pretty happy with those local election results. But I guess what they also underlined was just how big a swing Labour need in order to get a majority. That is a tall order, isn't it?
It sure is. And what I really liked, actually, about your last interview with Alistair Campbell was the way that he set out the progress that he thought the Labour Party needed to make. Now, he said that they needed to, that Keir Starmer had, detoxified the party, showed that the Conservatives were not fit to govern, and then was now creating a grand vision. Well, I would argue with him on some of those points. I think Keir Starmer has detoxified the brand. It's the Conservatives who have shown themselves that they are in a tricky spot when it comes to governing. I don't think Labour have really done that. And when it comes to the grand vision, I think you set this out perfectly with Johnny Reynolds. There's a long list of policies. Johnny Reynolds could rattle them off very easily, something to do with business rates. What is the grand vision? What does a Keir Starmer country look like? And I think voters still don't know that. And I think that is why we saw at the local elections, big swings, but will they win a majority? Will they be able to govern long term? I don't think we still have the answers to that.
Yeah, the big vision thing I do think is an important one. And I genuinely can't work out if it's because they just want to save it until closer to the election for strategy reasons, or because there actually isn't one. I actually don't know, to be completely honest. Who knows? Let's have a quick listen to Johnny Reynolds, shall we? I was talking to him about Keir Starmer's vision for Clause 4 on steroids under his leadership. Let's listen.
Well, I think there are arguments for expanding the franchise. It's not an area I directly deal with in the shadow cabinet, so I'm not going to give a definitive answer on that. But I think we should always be seeking to involve as many people as possible in our democracy. That's what strengthens democratic politics. That's what we need to see encouraged, and I think we haven't seen enough of that in recent times. So it's something we will look at. But some of the reports, as I've got to stress, they're not the final plans for the Labour manifesto. This is about the process by which we achieve that manifesto.
I made a mistake there. I thought that was about Clause 4 on steroids. I got the wrong bit of the Jonathan Reynolds. That was him talking about the voting system. Let's listen now to when he was talking about Clause 4 on steroids.
It's not just turning around an economy that hasn't functioned very well for 13 years, it's the complete reform and delivery on public services in a way where the scale of that, I don't think has ever been greater. And specifically for me, on the economic side of the Shadow Cabinet, that's bringing in the kind of modern industrial strategy we see in other countries. We see many parts of our economy, the automotive sector is a good example we're stressing today, where you need the state to be active, a partner, to draw in the kind of private investment that we're seeing in the US through things like the Inflation Reduction Act. But we haven't had a response here to that in the UK. You know, the fact that the UK has the lowest business investment in the G7, with all the good things, all the strength and innovation that we have in the UK, these are major problems, and Keir is laying out the scale of the challenge and his ambition and our ambition to meet that challenge.
Got there in the end. I need another coffee, obviously. It's an early start on Sunday. I need to keep my caffeine levels fully stocked up. Should we chat about the voting system stuff? I thought that was quite interesting because, in a way, he was saying, look, these are just reports, it's not official policy. But it was pretty clear that he backs it, right?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the things that has come out recently about the Labour Party. It's something potentially that we can hang our hat on in terms of what the Labour Party stands for, extending the franchise. It could be that just means that there's a lot more Labour voters. But to be honest, we've seen that happen on the Conservative side as well. Lots of boundary changes and, of course, voter ID at the last local elections. So, yeah, it's an interesting policy. It does seem like that's something that's going to get rolled out.
And just talking about the sort of rhetoric and the language that Labour's using, they're talking pretty big, right? Do you get any sense that there's going to be some bumper policy announcements anytime soon? Or
I agree with you. I think where the Labour Party is at, and Keir Starmer is hardworking and methodical, and he saw where the Labour Party was at and where it needed to be. And what they did was they ditched all of that ideology that came with Jeremy Corbyn. He's moved the party into the centre ground because he knows that is where political parties win general elections. But there is no big vision. You set out some policies that we can very easily point to when it comes to previous governments, you know, things like the minimum wage under Tony Blair, huge house building policies under previous Labour governments. What is the policy that really will define the Keir Starmer government? We don't have that, and it does feel like their offer to the electorate at the moment is we will just manage things better than the Conservative Party. Now, given what the Conservative Party has been through over the last few years, maybe that is a decent offer at the moment to the electorate, but I think they will need more if they want to take more of the country.
That's it. I guess it's the difference between kind of just limbering over the line and leaping over the line almost, isn't it? And I do sometimes wonder as well whether they're slightly bound by the iron grip that they say they have on the public finances, because I guess those are the two sort of warring different things that they might need to do in the Labour Party. Always good to get your analysis, Liz. Lovely to have Liz on the programme this morning. We'll have more from her after this short break.
My mum, who raised me as a single mother and had worked for 30 years, unfortunately, when she had a moment of need for the health service, unfortunately, it just wasn't there for her. She was 74, otherwise very fit and healthy. And upon her hospital care, she had 8 assessments across her initial passing through A&E, where she waited for 12 hours before being assessed by a first-year doctor, and then through cardiology and then as an outpatient. And not once did they consider pulmonary embolism as a potential symptom. That's a blood clot in the vein that causes heart failure. And yet it's the third highest heart disease killer after acute coronary syndrome and then stroke. She had 90% of the symptoms, so shortness of breath, chest pain, faintness, and she had a prior deep vein thrombosis, which is the other symptom relevant. And upon early diagnosis and treatment, it has a 92% survival rate. And upon the complaint that I'd raised to the Trust, they decided that upon their own review, which wasn't particularly independent, that they wouldn't have done anything differently. So after that, not only did I lost my mother, but we felt let down by the internal investigation. So I started writing and researching and looked into providing my own independent report, which I released in conjunction with Patient Safety Learning, a charity, and Joe Jerome's charity, Thrombosis UK.
The NHS England has actually led the world in doing risk assessments on everybody admitted into hospital. And they've done this because they know this is one of the highest group of at-risk individuals for blood clots. And they had brought the rate of death due to blood clots associated with hospitals down. But during the pandemic, this was suspended and the data has not been collected. So we no longer know or have that data to see whether people are carrying out VT risk assessments and then implementing appropriate treatments to reduce an individual's risk. What we do have is a more recent report in 2020 that shows that too often the risk assessment isn't being done, or the follow-up care needed to reduce those risks there's errors or further training is needed to safeguard those patients at risk.
Hello, welcome back to The Take, where we take you through some analysis of this morning's interviews. So we've heard from Grant Shapps, we've heard from Jonathan Reynolds. Quite often, though, I feel, with these shows, the most interesting interviews are given by people who are not a member of the front bench teams. It just gives them that bit more leeway to say what they really think. Rees Mogg, never somebody who shies away from giving his opinion. I've had quite a lot of people on Twitter say, why have you got him on the programme? Well, frankly, the reason is because he is influential among one of the key wings of the Conservative Party, the right. He's a backbencher and he's certainly not averse to causing a few problems for Rishi Sunak. Now, on the show today, he said that he still thinks it was a mistake to get rid of Boris Johnson, although he was effectively saying that he backs Rishi Sunak's leadership now. Let's listen.
Oh, yes, of course it was. I've said that a million times. But it would be an even bigger mistake now to get rid of Rishi Sunak. The Conservative Party cannot keep on changing leaders. We must back the leader we have got. I'm supporting Rishi Sunak. Let me be clear about that. And I said this at the conference yesterday, the CDO conference, that the Tory party would be toast if we changed leader again. And therefore we need to support the leader we've got. But that doesn't mean we agree with him on every policy. And to have a debate about policy is important and I hope interesting for Conservative members in the country at large.
Rees Mogg's there saying that he is supportive of Rishi Sunak. Do you think that's... What do you think of that claim?
Well, I think there's a few different elements to that. First of all, can we just take a moment to commend Rees Mogg for sticking so rigidly to his own brand? Was he sitting in a museum? I think there's an oil painting behind him, potentially. This urging people to back Rishi Sunak, I felt like, first of all, Rees Mogg is a realist. He's slightly under threat even in his own constituency, although he's got a pretty decent majority. The Lib Dems are threatening him, I think, there. He knows that the damage that's been done to the party by changing leaders, and although he is a big fan, no question, of Boris Johnson, he, I think, believes that changing the leader again would be a bad idea before the next general election. The other thing that really came across to me, and I saw him speaking at that conference yesterday, that was him saying, we still hold sway within the party. You may have sidelined this wing. We still have a voice. We've got the members behind us. And it was him saying, I can wield the knife if I want to.
Exactly.
I won't do it now, but I can.
And I can influence you while you're in the seat as well.
Exactly.
We had a bit of a to and fro about the Borgias, right? I guess I was being a little bit playful there by saying, look, just tell me, who are these guys? Explain it. But the serious point I was trying to make is I feel that Rees Mogg, and we see that with Boris Johnson as well, they drop in these references and they know that they'll then be written up saying the Borgias are these kind of murdering, corrupt guys who ended up getting poisoned. This is the reference he was making. Well, if that's what you're saying, say it on TV then. You know, make the actual accusation that you're saying about Rishi Sunak, and he wouldn't do it, would he?
No, I mean, Rees Mogg, whatever you think of his politics, is a skillful communicator, and he has been like that for many years under many different prime ministers, and he sprinkles these little references throughout his contributions to public life. And again, that is him saying to Rishi Sunak, I'm here, you need to take notice of me. I have power within the party and I can do damage to you if I want to.
Now, in the ad break, me and Liz were chatting about her day yesterday, and Liz revealed that she spent 6 hours on the coach down to Bournemouth, didn't you, because of the rail strikes yesterday?
And that is dedication, isn't it, on a Saturday to go to a conference of Conservative Party members.
What was the kind of main sort of takeaway then after you went down?
Well, I was extremely grumpy because I'd spent 6 hours on a coach. But my main takeaway was, you know, it's one of the things that's interesting about the Conservative Party is they are very willing to swallow all sorts of things in return for winning general elections. And the grumblings at that conference were about feeling that maybe Rishi Sunak isn't an election winner. And there was a lot of affection for Boris Johnson. And it's not particularly because of his policies or his ideology. It's because he was their Prime Minister that got them that 80-seat majority. And they are still holding on to that. And many of them there want to see him return.
Yeah, they certainly do. Liz, thank you very much for all your analysis. Lovely to have you here in the studio today. We'll have more from Liz on the podcast as well, because the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast will be available around lunchtime. It features me, Liz, and also show editor Scott Beasley. So do check out that one. Available wherever you get your podcast from. That's it for this week. Thank you very much for watching this morning. We will see you next Sunday. See you then.